From Chicago's Can TV, a look at the week's events is reported in the newspapers, in the blogs and online, and on radio and TV. This is Chicago Newsroom.
Well, hi again. Welcome to the show. You know, a couple of years ago, the Chicago Reporter and perhaps some others before them started putting out our city's violence epidemic into context. Chicago had a lot of murders, they said, but they were happening in wildly disproportionate patterns. We've all come to accept this now as fact, but a couple of years ago, it was really big news that most of our murders were happening in just a handful of zip codes. On today's show, we're going to look at some new charts and some new numbers and get an idea about how this pattern has intensified. And take it from me, it has tragically intensified over just 20 years. Some parts of Chicago are among the safest urban neighborhoods in North America. But at the other end of the spectrum, there are parts of Chicago where if you're just an ordinary resident, you're exposed to 15 times the murder rate than the safer parts. And here's the news, that ratio was just 1 to 6 back in the 90s, and it's up to 1 to 15 now. So what happened? Well, Daniel Hertz is going to help answer some of those questions for us today. A graduate student at the Harris School at the University of Chicago. Yep. Glad to have you on the show
Thanks
today.
so much
I'm
for
really
having
looking
me on.
forward to delving into these numbers. But I don't feel qualified to do this with you on my own, so I had to bring in some reinforcements, and I brought in the big guns. We got Salim Muwakkil with us here from WVON, and Salim and I have something in common, which is that we're a little older and we've been around for a while and we've watched some things happen. And also Robert Starks, Professor Robert Starks from the Carruthers Center for Inner City Studies, Northeastern Illinois University. Emeritus, congratulations to you, sir.
Yes,
so
sir.
Yet another member of the senior class.
There you go. Another emeritus, right?
Joining us here today. So good luck, Daniel. I understand you're still in your 20s, you've told us. So yeah,
For a little bit longer.
you
yeah.
kids today, you think you got it all down with.
Whippersnappers.
Yeah, they think they got it all down with their computers and their numbers and their graphs.
Fancy
Cell
schmancy
phones.
stuff.
Cell phones, yeah. All right, okay. So Daniel, a really good piece that you have done and that you have posted. I saw it and decided we just really got to build a show around this. And I'm not exactly sure how to begin this conversation other than that your piece has some wonderful graphics, and maybe we ought to just put up chart number 1 on the screen here and have you kind of walk us through it. Can you hand me that one, Salim? The other one over there, because that's my copy. I gave it to you, and I got to look at it myself. So we see two. We're very familiar with the city of Chicago. We see that outline, right? And we see a bunch of numbers. We've seen graphs like this before. But what exactly do these two cities mean? Can you kind of walk us through it?
Yeah, sure. So I sort of began, the beginning of my thought process when I started this project was exactly what you said, which is that we know homicides are concentrated in certain parts of the city, and we know also that overall homicides have gone down tremendously over the last 20 years. From the peak of the crack epidemic, they're down almost 50% in Chicago.
Something that's hard to keep
Something
in
that,
mind.
right, that's hard to keep in mind because there's still a lot of murders by any objective standard, but it's a lot better than it was. So I was interested in whether that decline had been sort of enjoyed equally by different neighborhoods. So I began by going online, getting some data from Chicago police reports, and so these two maps are homicide rate by police district. First at the sort of peak of the murder epidemic in the early 90s, and then from 2008 to 2011, so more recently. And basically the colors here mean green are neighborhoods that are safer than average compared to the early 90s. Pink are neighborhoods that are more dangerous than average compared to the early 90s. And so you can see that, from the early 90s to the 2000s, there's a lot more green.
A lot more green, a lot darker green.
A lot darker green, right.
Yeah.
And the darker it gets, the more, the safer. Or if it's pink, the more dangerous. So this was sort of the first step, and we see, it's gotten a lot safer. And the other thing that jumped out a bit about me, especially about the second map, is that the north side is pretty much entirely dark green, which actually works out, like you said, it has a murder rate of about 3.3 per 100,000. To put that in context, New York, which has gotten a lot of press for its incredible decline in murders and is called the safest big city in the country, is 6.3. And Toronto, as recently as 2007, was 3.3. So this really is one of the safest urban neighborhoods in North America.
well, it's a series of neighborhoods, and
Right, yeah.
And one of the things that I find really interesting is if you look all the way up in that top corner there, that top east corner, you see Rogers Park, and I believe, I think I read in here that there was as much as an 80% decline in murder in Rogers Park?
Yeah, over 80%. Rogers Park and the Loop were the two areas that had the highest drop, both over 80%.
Now, what about your old neighborhood, Albany Park?
Albany Park also had a big drop. I mean, you can sort of see on here, Albany Park was relatively safe to begin with, but it also saw a drop, and it's also now in dark green, which means that's one of those most safe neighborhoods.
So then, obviously, the other shoe here is the pinks, and what is really distressing about this is to see that there are communities where not only did the murder rate not drop, but it actually went up.
Yeah, actually, if you look at the second map here, it shows
That would be
how
our chart number 2 for
Yeah.
the people in the control room. Yeah.
it shows by police district how much the murder rates changed. And yeah, so the darker green it gets, the more it's dropped. You can see Rogers Park and the Loop are dark, dark, dark green. But yeah, all of that red is places where it actually got worse. And that includes places like Englewood and Garfield Park, which were already among the most dangerous.
And the west side.
And large parts of Austin, large parts of the south side. I should say that overall, the most dangerous third of the city did get a little bit safer. It got about 20% safer, but still, in major parts of the city, it actually got worse.
So, is there any correlation between police patrols and the drop in crime or the increase in crime in these neighborhoods? Because remember, the chief of police contends that his strategy of concentrating police in certain districts accounts for the drop in crime. Is that true, or?
I that was sort of beyond the scope of this project. I don't know. I've certainly seen some reports that flooding a very small area with police officers is at least temporarily effective.
Okay.
But when you look at these maps, I mean, the areas in Chicago that are truly, where there is a real serious murder problem, I think are just too big to do that with. I mean,
Did you make any correlation with income?
I haven't done any statistical analyses, but I will say that for me, the context of this whole thing is a report I read that came out of Stanford, I think in 2011, that was a really comprehensive look at income inequality, or rather income segregation in metropolitan areas across the country. And it showed that, at the same time that racial segregation is getting slightly better, income segregation is getting way, way, way worse. And so, Chicago has one of the poor people in Chicago are more segregated from other people than in almost any other city. And it's gotten much worse over the same period. So, I would.
There's probably a close correlation.
I would assume that, there is.
Well, I mean, you've pointed out that we're starting to look almost like a kind of a South American nation, or the parts of the world where you have these immensely rich people living in towers looking down on the slums, and we're beginning to be one of those
wealth
cities.
disparities.
Yeah.
I think the traditional pattern of the way cities are made is generally that the elite live in the core in the inner city, and those less privileged live in the periphery. The development of cities in this country has been a little bit different because of the industrial concentration in the cities and the attraction of Southern black folks to work in these factories, but that's reverting, I think, right now.
Well, it was almost like it was an aberration
Yes,
for a
it was,
while.
absolutely.
The richer people were moving away from the core,
That's right.
and then they got only so far, and
And they
said,
say, where are we
this-
going?
This is screwed up, man. We need to be down there.
Why do I have to drive 25
There you
miles
go.
to work?
That's right. That's right.
Right. And actually, if you look at the maps, one of the few places that got safer, much safer on the south and west sides are the areas right next to downtown. The West Loop, Pilsen, Upper Bronzeville.
Absolutely.
Well, I mean, part of this thing is, this is kind of a weird conversation for me, because it's really important to have this conversation, and really important to have somebody look at these numbers so that you can actually put this chart in front of you and have it smack you in the face. But then there's also the kind of the reaction, like tell me something I don't
Exactly,
know, right?
exactly.
I mean, if we asked you to go back and chart industrial decline in the city, or to chart school closings in the city, or city investment in communities in the city, the foreclosures. We could probably think of 30 graphs, and you wouldn't have to even waste the ink because you could print the same graph for every one of them. It's the same. It's the same story. So, should we be surprised that when you, by policy or by other actions, concentrate some of the poorest and least educated and most victimized people in your society into a couple of small neighborhoods, that they kill each other? I mean, I hate to be so crass about it, but isn't that looking at it as a function of how many people are being murdered is really only as tragic as it is. It's only a symptom of everything else.
That is true. Very true. Very true.
I mean, the one thing, I completely agree that I don't think this report shocked many people. I think the main reaction I've gotten to it is, oh, it's so nice to have what I already thought in numbers.
Right. And that's the way I felt about it too, by the way. And I'm really glad that you did it, and it's a really good thing to see.
But I will say that I think we shouldn't underestimate how much things have actually changed over the last 20 years. 20 years ago we had rich and poor neighborhoods. 20 years ago, again, 6-to-1 ratio from the most dangerous to the least dangerous in terms of number of murders. The chart that I actually thought was the most sort of disturbing of this whole thing is when I actually sort of made a chart of, all right, how many police districts fit where on the spectrum.
Oh, that's the blue one. That's the last one.
It's 4 and 5. So if you look,
let's look at that, because that's kind of interesting.
If you look in the early 90s, you basically have what you would expect. Most neighborhoods are in the middle, and it sort of goes down as you get further and further out onto the extremes.
In the middle, meaning in what regard?
Meaning, so this is how many police districts basically have, if you're in the middle of this distribution, you have an average crime rate for the city. As you go towards the right, it's more dangerous. As you go toward the towards the left, it's less dangerous. And you can see, most neighborhoods are kind of average, and then you go out and it gets lower and lower as you get more and more extreme. If you turn and look at what the city looks like today, it's totally different. I mean, you basically have two completely separate distributions.
There's the bottom map for those of you following us at home.
There's still some neighborhoods that are sort of hanging out in the middle, but you have basically two completely separate cities. On one that's safe, that's sort of peaking around this 0.2 to 0.4, one that's still very dangerous on the right, and that level of disparity is new. And
that
we should react
in the last decade.
And we should react to it as if it's new. We can't treat this like it's normal, because it's not.
Right. And I think that's actually that's a very good point to raise, Daniel. Is this notion that it is easy for us to just say, yeah, well, we've seen all this before, but there are underlying things that we haven't certainly we haven't graphed out before. That we have a sense that we're becoming two cities in a way that we were always two cities, or 2 or 3 or 4 cities. But boy, are we two cities now.
Exactly.
Like on WVON, whenever the police commissioner or the superintendent gets on and says something like crime is going down, we're on a downward spiral. The callers always erupt in outrage. What are you talking about?
That's a tough sell on WVON.
It really is.
It's
a tough sell. And it points out the kind of almost apartheid nature of this crime situation.
And so then, of course, we can't get away from the fact that a major piece of this economic disparity, of this apartheid, is really racial. I mean, it's black and white, and it's always sort of an impolite conversation to have, but it is. I mean, which is not to say that there isn't a prospering black middle class in Chicago that seems to be doing fairly well, but I don't know.
Increasingly less so.
I was going to say, my sense of it is that it is declining.
Exactly.
Am I right about that?
The 2008, 2009 economic meltdown just wiped out scores of people in the middle class. And now you're going to see an even more concentrated decline because you lay off, 3,000 teachers? And that teacher corps was a major part of the black middle class. And then that means you're going to see a proliferation in foreclosures, etc.
So yeah, we're going to have another round of foreclosures.
That's exactly right, because people can't afford to keep their houses.
Yeah,
You know?
yeah. So, okay, help me out with this. What's why? Why?
Well, you know,
is this?
I think you know.
You must think about this all the
Oh,
time.
I do.
Why
I mean,
is this?
we
I mean,
always-
is it?
I have a very specific answer to it, but a lot of folks don't agree with my answer. my answer is essentially reparations in the form of a Marshall Plan
Yes,
for the
I
black
would
community.
agree.
We have not addressed the injuries of generations of socialization for subservience in our community. Generations, slavery and Jim Crow apartheid, and the lack of a cultural capital that we haven't been able to develop because of our constant reacting to assaults on our humanity. And so until we deal with that in a serious and comprehensive way, we're going to always have these problems, I think. And we are reluctant to face this. And I think we need to become much more explicit in making this point.
I would agree 100%.
But someone
Absolutely.
posted on your Facebook thing the other day, somebody was arrested for stealing an iPod at the Air and Water
Oh,
show.
yes,
It
yes.
must be because of slavery.
Well, this is an ongoing dispute that I have with this guy, and I understand their point. You know, don't blame slavery
blame
for
slavery. That
everything.
was-
You know, it's
yeah,
not an
okay.
overall excuse for bad behavior, and I understand that. That's absolutely true. But if you look at all of the indications of socioeconomic vitality, or even a sense of well-being, of socioeconomic well-being, black people are on the bottom end of that spectrum, and so you have to ask from where does that derive? If you assume that we all have equal capacities as humans, and we see that, you know, in many black communities, as you point out, a lot of black people are successful and have done well in the society, but increasing numbers are not. And I think if you trace that distress, it can only go back to one thing, and that's our history in this country. And until we have been resolute in avoiding this conversation, we have to begin to be more explicit.
It's also interesting when it's held up in comparison to every other, to the extent that you can call them community. I mean, it's again, these are impolite conversations to have, but we see the Latino community in Chicago not exactly prospering, but certainly doing relatively well, and on the build, I would say, economically and in other ways. And yet we just see this continuing moribund situation with the black community in Chicago, and if anything, we're seeing decline. And I do want to just comment that something that you touched on that I think is so important, because wealth came so late to African Americans and is relatively small even at that. You have this generational issue that if the kids lose their house or they lose their mortgage, they can't turn to their mom and dad
absolutely right.
the way those of us who have that privilege can. And so most people who have generations of, I wouldn't even call it wealth, but at least sustainability in their families, there's something you can call on that doesn't exist in your community.
Precisely.
true.
And I mean, I don't know where we go with that. There's not. It's just something that you can lament. I don't know that there's anything.
Well,
that can
even the point that you make about Latinos coming in and kind of passing African Americans on their way to the American dream, which is how a lot of people phrase it, is because most people come with cultural capital. They have ancestral connections.
Very good point.
They have
Yeah.
they have historical narratives that make
Right.
them, that give them a kind of cultural esteem.
Right.
African Americans were absolutely prevented from developing that kind of cultural capital. And that's one of the things that's lacking. And so when we look at these other populations coming in and succeeding, they have something that we have yet to develop because we were prevented from developing.
And we have to also look at the fact that African Americans were brought here, we didn't come as immigrants.
with a dollar in your pocket, right?
Right. So that's a big difference.
Yeah,
Big
yeah.
difference.
I mean, I would also say, I mean, not even a little bit to belittle the challenges that the Latino community in Chicago goes through, because they're, you know, formidable. But you know, the Black community in Chicago has a history of forced segregation and you know, oppression that just isn't matched by any other community. I actually just wrote a post about this, about, you know, what Chicago talks about when we talk about the riots in our history.
Or doesn't talk about. But
Or doesn't talk about.
Right.
Well, no, exactly. I mean, we don't. I mean, there was a you know, here and in many other places, there was a campaign of, you know, white terrorism against the Black community for decades and decades, in which people were killed and houses were burned down and all sorts of things that continued into the 60s and 70s. And you know, that just is not on our radar screen at all. And I would love for Chicago to have, you know, some kind of communication or some sort of conversation about that.
But then, Ken, the other thing that bothers me is nobody wants to face up to the fact that drugs and guns were deliberately dumped in the African American community. We don't grow drugs on rooftop gardens in Chicago, in the Black community. We don't manufacture guns in the basement. Somebody is putting them there. Where?
You mean it's being used as a convenient distribution
as a way of
point
quieting,
because it's
and a way of quieting protest and quieting uprisings.
Well,
and I think that really began in the 1970s and is continuing now.
Well, you know, Michelle Alexander makes the very good point that this kind of law and order mentality that was prevalent during the 60s, the Nixon,
and the 70s.
George Wallace, and all of that, a kind of anxiety about the Black civil rights movement and Black Power movement was manifested in an increased concern about law and order, and so the criminal justice system responded to these anxieties in a way that made it easier to incarcerate
mass incarceration,
young Black
which
people.
of course gets us to the whole conversation of the disproportionate you know, minority populations in our prisons. It's just you know, I don't know, you want to do a ratio thing, it's
it's incredible.
Talking about
8 to 1 or
apartheid.
something, right? Yeah.
Absolutely.
I think, yeah, I mean, actually, there's a guy, Robert Sampson, who was at U of C and is now at Harvard, and just wrote a book about sort of neighborhood effects and whatever. And one of the things he found, he mostly studied Chicago, one of the things he found was that if you chart like incarceration rate by neighborhood, I mean, you have white neighborhoods down here, and Black neighborhoods are just an order of magnitude higher. I mean, it's not.
See, I think I have a chart of incarceration rate
Well,
by neighborhood.
yeah.
No, but I'm curious. I don't get to assemble this panel very often, and I want to know what you guys think about Superintendent McCarthy saying that one way we got to get guns off the streets is mandatory minimum prison sentences for people who are found with guns while they're committing crimes. That seems like such a common sense thing. I think most people probably would say, yeah, if you're committing a crime with a gun, you should go to prison. But we're now beginning to see the downside, the unintended consequences of these mandatory minimums. They take away the discretion of judges and they crowd up the prisons.
I think McCarthy would be better suited if he were to look at who's bringing the guns into the community. I mean, I am absolutely convinced that given the NSA and all the surveillance techniques, that they could find who is bringing the drugs in and who's bringing the guns in. These guns that just don't appear out of the sky. Someone is bringing them in. And young kids can tell you where to go and get a gun.
Yeah, there are so many of these things that seem like
tell you where to go to get the drugs and where to
yeah.
get the guns.
Yeah.
But see, the thing, I think the other aspect of this is that there are always ways to stop crime. I mean, you can have almost a crime-free city if you really wanted to. I mean, you can lock up people, you can abort young males, you know, and who commit the crimes, and that would stop it. So the question is how do you best
There you go.
attenuate the problem of crime-riven communities, and I think that more egalitarian programs seems to me to be the most logical way to go. Although that kind of logic is having a hard time these days. Most profit logic is the
right.
is
Well, I was going to say that's a nice idea,
market
Salim,
logic,
but
right?
how can you make money off of that?
exactly. Right.
So how can AT&T profit from that? What about we have just seconds left here, but this brouhaha that's going on in New York about the stop and frisk, federal court said they can't do it. The mayor is upset. The city council is upset. They're making noises that New York could become more like Chicago, and yet
or Detroit, even worse.
But in fact, Chicago does quietly,
quietly,
de facto,
absolutely.
Right. Mm-hmm.
I mean, drive down any street in these communities, and you'll see young kids with their hands on the cars being
assuming the position, as they say.
Assuming the position, absolutely, absolutely.
So yeah, I mean, but that goes along with what I'm saying. I mean, Bloomberg's rejoinder to that is, well, crime is more prevalent in these communities. That's why these people are stopped more frequently.
And I think that's a common wisdom. I think people would say
indeed.
that.
Indeed.
And some of the columnists on the right say, well, of course, the reason we don't stop and frisk many white people is that white people don't engage in much crime.
Right.
But finish that thought. You were
Well, I mean, you know, and that and also that black people are the most victimized by these crimes.
yeah.
That's his logic,
That's his
and there's truth to that, of course. But I think that truth is a product of this same process that I'm talking about. You're concentrating this poverty in a certain area. People act according to their environment.
But of course, the governor of New York then says, so who's going to be more victimized by this? It's going to be the minority communities,
what they
because
say.
crime is going to go up if we can't get in there and stop and frisk.
Exactly.
And your reaction is?
My reaction is, of course, there are, if you don't stop, if you abort all of the young black males, you can also stop crime. I mean, there's all kind of ways.
And that is, of course, one of the right-wing positions.
Indeed. And in fact, I think Freakonomics people.
Exactly.
Yeah, I was
made
going
that
to say
claim.
University of Chicago.
University of Chicago.
Economics, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, so there are ways of doing it, you know.
But I still want to know, in the here and now of this moment, is crime in the minority community in New York going to go up if the police are not stopping and frisking?
I don't think so.
I don't think so. No.
And that's because?
Well, I think, you know, crime is going down in other cities as well. New York has been surprisingly precipitous, but you know, if you consider other aspects, you know, I know a lot of people who say that crime began to go down in the mid '90s, right after the Million Man March. So that these guys came back from the Million Man March with new ideas, and since that time, crime has been going down in black communities across the country. They say, why aren't people looking at that as a factor? That may be a stretch, but it is, you know, it's something to consider. Those kinds of things. It's not simply these kinds of militaristic reactions.
And that's going to be the last word. No more militaristic reaction. I know we've been kind of giggling a little bit here today, but it's an incredibly serious topic, and we're kind of friends, so we get, we're just kind of hanging out and talking about something that we can't solve, I'm afraid. Salim Muwakkil from WVON, thanks so much for being with us again, and it's always a pleasure to have you. Bob Starks, we haven't had you on before, but I hope you'll come back again. Professor Emeritus, now retired mostly from the Center for Inner City Studies.
They won't let him get out.
Yeah, right. And Daniel, great to have you here. Daniel Hertz from the University of Chicago, the Harris School of Business, right?
Of public policy.
Public policy, I'm sorry, public policy. Glad to have you here. You've been watching Chicago Newsroom. It's a community service of CAN TV, and you can see us here all the time, but you can also go to this address, and you can watch us any old time you want on iTunes, and you can subscribe, too. It's a cool thing. You should give it a try. I'm Ken Davis. We'll be back again next week with yet another conversation on Chicago Newsroom. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time. Bye.